Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. As you can see, I am back home in the south of France. Humphrey is here. Remember him? Yes. I'm going to be here for a bit, so you'll definitely see me again tomorrow from this room. Next weekend, again, might be busy, but I'll do my best to have some material for you as well from this room. Okay, so today we're going to be finishing our series about Nietzsche and move on to something else tomorrow, probably something to do with personality. This is not dirt, by the way. It's called henne, and this is part of a tradition that I was a part of when I was in Algeria, but I'm keeping some of it private, at least for now. Before I move on to my topic, finishing with Nietzsche, remember that I have written 2 books in the last couple of years. My book on the INFJ, The Ecstatic Soul, and my new novel, The Infinite Castle. It's a very nice product if you like Kafka, existentialism, Dostoevsky, Camus, and INFJ characters. Check it out, check those out. All the links down below, less than $10 for either one. And don't forget that you can support me on Patreon. There's been more and more support on my Patreon page, and that is so encouraging to me with regard to the long-term, viability of my channel. So thank you so much for your support, and don't forget that you can continue supporting for other ones who may be considering it. It really helps. So what I done last week with the 2 videos on Nietzsche that I released is I was trying to portray Nietzsche as a particularly systematic thinker, which is a feature of Nietzsche that is actually not emphasized very often. The most common descriptions of Nietzsche are descriptions of an insightful thinker, penetrating thinker, very intuitive thinker, often portrayed in the typology communities as a perception dominant, perception leads, NI leads to be specific. The nearly overwhelming majority thinks INTJ, but I think a case could actually be made for INFJ. I've discussed this on my channel before, so I'll refer you back to that video if you're curious to explore it. But, in addition to all the kind of literary and poetic merits that Nietzsche has, it's rare that people would say, well, he's also actually quite systematic and consistent. People are more tempted to think that he's unsystematic and inconsistent, so that's kind of a flaw that you have to forgive in the face of all the otherwise great qualities that his thought and writing have. So I try to make the point that his critique of nihilism in the way that he understands it, of beyond the worldness, otherworldliness, rejection of this world. He wants to embrace this world that we have here, material world, world of humans, the terrestrial world, the non-spiritual world. He wants to be a yeah-sayer. He always says that, to have good cheer, in embracing this world. So the rejection of this otherworldly nihilism is along 4 axes, in fact. The axis of metaphysics. Heidegger says Nietzsche ended metaphysics, made it very hard to do metaphysics after him. The religious axis, God is dead and all this. The ethical axis, criticism of morality, and particularly Christian and Kantian morality of obligation and punishment, instead of an ethics of flourishing. And epistemology and theory of knowledge, by the idea that the notion that absolute truth ought to be rejected because absolute truth is necessarily referring to a transcendent world beyond, which metaphysically has been rejected. So all this is articulated actually quite systematically, although the structure and the system are not always plainly visible to the eye, because they tend to be, or they can be covered up by these rhetorical and lyrical flourishes that Nietzsche is famous for. But underneath that, you can see, if you look closely, a pretty rigorously organized thought. Now, what are Nietzsche's actual failings, because we want to say, okay, like, he is an important philosopher. His fame is certainly deserved, although it is true that there is a dimension of his fame that is due to people simplifying his thought, misunderstanding his thought, thinking it is cool to like Nietzsche because it's edgy. That doesn't make him any less important as a philosopher otherwise, you know. And in fact, he's become, over time, more and more appreciated, not just in continental philosophy, which is the philosophy outside, you know, the West, outside the Anglo-Saxon world, where he has been super influential for a long time, almost from, you know, the end of his life onwards. But also in the analytic side of philosophy, the Anglo-Saxon world, where he used to be quite rejected, because interested in topics that analytic philosophy tends to see as meaningless from a philosophical point of view, ethics, metaphysics, religion, all these aspects that he's critiquing. But now there's more and more interest in Nietzsche on that side. And usually that's a good sign. It's a sign that maybe he was underrated by that side of the philosophical divide for a long time. In fact, that also is happening with Heidegger and Hegel in recent decades. Now, we still want to say Nietzsche is not, you know, completely impervious to critique. Nietzsche has failings in his philosophy. If we want to be critical of Nietzsche's critiques, then we have to be able to say a few words about that, at least, before we finish. What I would say, personally, and I think that probably a lot of people would agree with me, and I would dare believe that a lot of philosophers who love Nietzsche for many of the aspects of his thought would agree too, is that Nietzsche, and here I think that I will kind of circle back and agree with my friend, right, who was saying Nietzsche's ideas are mediocre. It's the fact that Nietzsche is much better and much better appreciated as a destructive and as a deconstructive philosopher than he is as a constructive philosopher. Now that might seem, at first sight, as a great indictment of Nietzsche. Because what's the point in not being a constructive philosopher? Offering a coherent system that you can embrace, a la Marx or Hegel or Spinoza or Descartes, or perhaps Bertrand Russell in more modern times, if there is such a thing as a constructive Bertrand Russell. Nietzsche not so much, because although his critique of otherworldly nihilism, I think, is very penetrating and very influential, up to this day, as I tried to emphasize in my previous video, that the extremes of political correctness and thought police really are reminiscent of a lot of the Christian exaggerations that Nietzsche really roasted, you know. When it comes to offering something instead, because after all, people need something to live by, they need something to operate with, otherwise you're critiquing but you're not really offering an alternative. Now, if you're not able to offer a cogent alternative, that doesn't disarm the bite of your critique. You could have someone who is like really cogent and biting with their critique, but doesn't really know what else to offer instead. That doesn't actually take the edge of their critique, but they still have to admit that, you know, as long as they haven't offered anything in replacement, people might be more aware that what they're embracing is not far from perfect, but they might stick to it because they don't know of anything else. It's, you know, there's an obvious and slightly too obvious analogy with capitalism nowadays. You know, critiques of capitalism are very penetrating and very biting, and we are aware of a lot of the failings of capitalism. It's not so much that we think it's amazing, but what else should we embrace? The alternatives that are viable are not really forthcoming, are they? So in the case of Nietzsche, we have a similar situation to this, where his theory of the overman, let's be honest with ourselves, it's inspiring as a metaphor. It's an interesting symbol, but that's something to live with. It's not very realistic, and it's probably a little bit, at times I find it a bit juvenile, in Nietzsche's thought, a bit immature, to think that we could all, or even that some of us could, train ourselves or equip ourselves to create our own values so that we stop depending on external systems of value that hate the world. To create a system of value for yourself is something that is just not very consonant with how humans operate. Forgive me. We do need external systems, external frameworks. It's very, very unlikely that we'll ever be able to each be like this purely self-affirming, yay-saying, autonomous individual. Like, maybe there are exceptional people like this, although you could also argue that the individuals like this that Nietzsche idealized, Napoleon being one of them, he probably idealized them a bit too. They were probably like figures in his mind to illustrate the end of his thought without necessarily being as aligned with reality as he might have thought. It's a bit of an unrealistic philosophy. As a constructive philosophy, to think that we could, once we have, disarmed and disabled the otherworldliness of our nihilism as a framework, replace it with something that looks much more like a Greek god type individual ethic, is something that I don't think a lot of people, it's so elitist that it might even exaggerate the possibility for the elites, if there are any, to live up to it. So I think it's something that we can work with when we're critiquing other systems, to remain aware of their flaws, limitations, and the ideologies, and the way when they try to intimidate us and impose things on us. It's very useful to look at those from a Nietzschean perspective. And I try to do that a little bit in my last videos. But when it comes to offering an alternative, it's not really constructive, which is why I call it deconstructive and destructive. Now, mind you, some of the most celebrated philosophers of the 20th century have been deconstructive. Of course, maybe when we think of deconstruction, we think of Derrida, and we think maybe of Foucault, and we think of maybe, some other French post-structuralist thinkers. Now, you'll notice that they all have in common that, they might have interesting critiques of society and postmodern society, capitalism, so on. Very rarely do they have any alternative, except irony, because they have stopped believing in the very possibility of an alternative, which is why they refer to the end of meta-narratives to describe this condition, the postmodern condition, to use the title of Jean-François Lyotard's book. They're all real inheritors of Nietzsche. Now, someone who's not directly an inheritor of Nietzsche, but who has a lot in common with him in terms of being deconstructive, even though he's on the other side of the divide, more so in the analytic school, even though he doesn't completely fit. The fitting is not perfect either, is Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is a deconstructive philosopher. He doesn't have a constructive philosophy. He's nevertheless considered a very important philosopher, and rightly so. I think Nietzsche and Wittgenstein could possibly be the two most influential philosophers of the last 150 years. Both deconstructive. So, take it for what it can offer you. Maybe one edge that Wittgenstein has over Nietzsche when it comes to that deconstructive approach is that Wittgenstein was very aware that he was deconstructive and he doesn't try to offer anything constructive. Whereas Nietzsche did try. And everything that has to do with it, the idea of the last man, of the overman or the superman, the idea of the eternal return or the eternal recurrence, many of these ideas, I would argue, are not the most important and influential in Nietzsche's thinking. They are worth looking at and taking an interest in for sure, but his more critical approach, the savagery and depth of his critiques, are what's most important. He helps us sharpen our thinking and not be intimidated by illegitimate systems of thought that try to intimidate us. So I will stop here with Nietzsche, and tomorrow we'll go back to MBTI. or some other system, or INFJs or some other type. I'll keep the surprise. Maybe I don't know yet myself. We'll see. In the meantime, have a great day, guys, and I will see you tomorrow. Don't forget you can support me on Patreon. Ciao.